Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to yet another Monday evening talk. Um, Today, now that we have passed Advent Sunday, that was yesterday, of course, even though it's still November, technically, I think it's probably safe now to talk about Christmas music and carols in particular. So that is what I propose to spend a little time on today, because it is a really fascinating area and one which I think there is quite a lot of confusion about. So I'll try and clarify what I mean by a Christmas carol and what is a carol and all of those things. But before even I do that, I thought it's just worth clarifying also the whole topic of Advent. We've now come to think about Advent with Advent preparations for Christmas, and we tend to think about Advent calendars and a kind of prequel to what is to come with Christmas. But of course, in reality, or certainly in its original form, Advent wasn't quite like that at all. Advent itself, it comes from the Latin word adventus, meaning coming, and was originally had very little, if any, connection with Christmas. It was instead much more like a period of what that we would associate with Lent. It was a period of preparation for the baptism of new Christians that would take place in what we think of as the new year, around January, February time. So it was an opportunity for prayer, for penitence, and for fasting, as for 40 days and 40 nights, just like the Lent period. And it was much more importantly about that aspect of Christianity than anything to do with Christmas, certainly in its early days. And it wasn't until something like the 6th century that there came to be a connection between Advent, the coming, and Christmas. But in particular, it was to do with the second coming rather than the first coming, which may seem a little bit odd. But obviously, the prophets decreed that Christ would come not once, but twice. And the first coming, of course, is what we know as Christ's birth of Christmas. But the second coming is not yet with us. So part of the Advent preparation from the 6th century onwards was connected with the whole business of expecting the second coming, not just thinking about the first coming, if you see what I mean. It's all quite complicated. Not until completely into the Middle Ages before Advent became kind of permanently associated with Christmas. But even then, it's, as you know, Advent is marks the beginning of the liturgical calendar. So it makes sense to see it as that preparation for Christ's birthday. But even in the Middle Ages, it was still thought of as being a kind of two-edged preparation. So the first half will be considering the second coming. That's the first 2 weeks of Advent. And the second 2 weeks was going to be all about Christmas itself, which is, as it were, looking back to the first coming, if you see what I mean. And also the 4 weeks, the 4 Sundays, because there are 4 Sundays in Advent, and they all had their own specific themes. So week 1 was connected with hope. Week 2 was the preparation or the prophecy aspect. Week 3 was a celebration of joy and peace. And the final week of Advent was connected to adoration, to love, and all of that implies. So Advent as a period of preparation, I think it's good to see it in those terms, to see it as a moment of repose, of seclusion, very appropriate for where we are at the moment. Also a preparation by fasting, or maybe cutting back, shall we say, of prayer, contemplation, penitence, all of those things. And if we could maintain that aspect of Advent, I think it would make the joyfulness of Christmas itself so much better, rather than having this sort of continuous Christmas build up of expectation and jollity and all of those things. Call me an old Scrooge, but I do think some return to the original meaning of Advent would be appropriate. And just to give an example of the sort of thing that Advent we associate, if you think of O Come Emmanuel, which is very much a song, a hymn, if you like, Veni Veni Emmanuel, that was sung by the Israelites as they hoped for, in their case, the first coming. And that tune itself, which is way back, I mean, Middle Ages modal tune, is in the Aeolian mode. With those flat sevenths. So very much typical of its kind. It's a kind of rather elaborate plain song melody, and all the words that we've come to attach to it are much later, more like 18th century words. The original tune goes way back to the Middle Ages, and that's where we get into the carol itself. And for many years I was under the impression that a carol needed to have a chorus to be called a carol, whereas a hymn didn't have to have a chorus, and more often than not didn't. I think that's actually completely wrong. And instead, the way I would see it now is that the two ideas, the hymn and the carol, have effectively grown into one, especially at Christmas time. And we associate, whether it's a traditional carol or a traditional Christmas hymn, we tend to lump them all together, and that's probably the right way to think of it, even though their origins are very different. First of all, carol. The word carol is probably derived from the Latin word carula, which means a circular dance. So straight away we can see the background to a carol is one of much more frivolity. It's connected with the idea of dancing, more often than not in a triple time signature. And this could be not just a religious event, but it could be used for anything, a celebration of harvest, winter solstice. So very much a pagan tradition of carol singing and carol dancing around a circular dance around a set of stones, for instance, at Stonehenge, would be a carol. So not necessarily anything to do with any kind of religion, let alone Christianity. Also, carols were used throughout the year and very often sung out of doors or by individuals going around from one house to another, door to door. These people were often referred to as wassailers, and you hear about wassail, lots of references to wassailing, very much associated with conviviality, drinking, celebrating, and again, not necessarily anything to do with religion. And now, of course, most carols have disappeared, apart from those that we associate with Christmas, or that there are a few also that we associate with Easter. But traditionally, they would all have been used at any time of the year for any kind of celebration, harvest, solstice, sunsets, whatever. So they have become much more specific from something which was much more general and definitely non-religious. Hymns, on the other hand, the derivation of a hymn is much more closer connected to plain song, to plain chant, and then to the Lutheran chorale. So the whole tradition of hymns and hymn singing has come up from a much more religious, organized religious background. So you have the carol on the one hand, which is slightly frivolous, often celebratory, can possibly be connected to dance and can be connected to some idea of celebration and paganism and not necessarily religious at all. Whereas the hymn is very much part of the liturgy, or it's grown out of the liturgy of the Christian church. So those are the two derivations, and the fact that nowadays they've become almost to mean the same thing. A Christmas hymn and a Christmas carol are pretty much interchangeable. So the first known Christian hymns date from around the 4th century. In Rome, pieces like Veni Redemptor Gentium and Corde Natus ex Parentis, which is we know as of the Father's heart begotten. Of the Father's heart begotten. The original Latin version of that, both the melody and the tune, Corde Natus ex Parentis, dates from as far back as the 4th century, a long, long time ago. By the 13th century, our old friend St. Francis of Assisi was very influential in encouraging singers to sing popular Christmas songs in their native language as part of the celebrations that took place in Italy in the 13th century. Carols in English, with English texts, first appeared in Caroles of Christimas, which was published in 1426 by John R. Audley, and pieces such as The Holly and the Ivy date from that. So 1426, The Holly and the Ivy, as old as that. And then we move on to 1582, when a very famous collection of late medieval Latin songs called Pie Cantiones was published. So pieces like Personam Hodie, that one. Also Latin versions of Good Christian Men Rejoice, Good King Wenceslas, can also be found in this book. So as far back as 1582, Good King Wenceslas. After the Reformation, singing of carols and hymns was encouraged, not only by the Lutheran Church, but other Protestant churches as well. They wanted the congregation, the members of the congregation, to join in as much as possible, instead of leaving it to the professionals or to ordained ministers. So although the Catholic Church was still quite reluctant to allow carols and Christmas hymns to be sung, the Protestant churches were much, much more enthusiastic about it. And it's interesting that a piece like, for instance, Adeste Fideles, or as we come to think of it as O Come All Ye Faithful, that dates from the middle of the 18th century, which is also quite a long time ago. And even that, the words probably date even further back than that. The original Latin words maybe go back as far as the 13th century. So in its form that we have become used to, that dates from the middle of the 18th century, but it's all from a long, long time ago. In 1833, another publication, Christmas Carols Ancient and Modern, which is, I suppose, the equivalent of the hymns Ancient and Modern, but Christmas Carols Ancient and Modern was published by William Sandys in 1833, and it's from that we get pieces like God Rest You Merry Gentlemen, The First Noel, I Saw Three Ships, and indeed Hark the Herald. Now, Hark the Herald we associate with a tune by Mendelssohn, but of course Mendelssohn didn't write it, didn't write the carol. It was just part of a work by Mendelssohn that was adapted to join with the words to produce what we think of as Hark the Herald, Angels Sing. The Victorians, of course, loved to sing carols and hymns, and hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds, were written during the Victorian period in this country. People like John Stainer were responsible for quite a few. Isaac Watts wrote Joy to the World, which has become very much a feature of Christmas celebrations, although it wasn't necessarily intended just for Christmas, but we tend to perform Joy to the World a lot at Christmas time. Charles Wesley, and as I said, the earliest versions of Hark the Herald were all dating from that kind of period during the Victorian era. And then we come into this century, and in 1928, the famous Oxford Book of Carols, which was edited by by Martin Shaw and Ralph Vaughan Williams. Oxford Book of Carols, very much still in use, still in print, and a kind of Bible of literally dozens and dozens of carols, some of which have become very well known, some have just been completely forgotten, become very, very obscure indeed. So that was 1828. And then more recently, the famous Carols for Choirs series began in 1961. This is where David Wilcox really got together with Reginald Jacques, and they put together this collection, not just of carols and hymns, but also new arrangements, some new ideas intended for choirs to sing rather than congregations. And this series has completely revolutionized the way we approach Christmas music and Christmas carols, especially from a choral perspective. And the Carols for Choirs, as you know, there are now, I think, 5 versions, 5 different books of Carols for Choirs, and some absolute gems in there with some very fine arrangements indeed. Other carols had some very different backgrounds that you'll know about. I know Silent Night, for instance, which is still, I think, one of the most beautiful. That dates from Christmas Eve of 1818. It came to light in a church, St. Nicholas Church in Oberndorf in Austria. And Gruber wrote the tune of Silent Night to existing words and put a very simple guitar accompaniment. And very often with Silent Night, although there are umpteen, aren't there, really complex and outlandish arrangements of Silent Night, very often the simplest arrangements of that particular carol work best, because when you think of it, it's just a very, very simple tune and a gentle guitar broken chord type of accompaniment is often the best way to do it. Coming more recently still, we associate carols with the 9 lessons and carols, which we associate with King's College, Cambridge. This first started in 1918, so at the end of the First World War was the first time that they actually put together the 9 lessons and carols at King's College, Cambridge. And it's, of course, happened every single year since then. The BBC started to broadcast it on radio in 1928, and it was then broadcast on the television, I think from the 1950s, 1954, something like that. So ever since then, it's become a kind of national institution. But interestingly, the whole concept of the 9 lessons and carols didn't begin at King's College, Cambridge. There is evidence that the idea started off before that, in particular at Truro in jolly old Cornwall. Bishop Edward Benson, Bishop of Cornwall, Bishop of Truro, in the 1880s, decided that he needed a way of getting people out of the pubs, the Cornish pubs, because of the indulgence that they were prone to. And he thought, I know, if I produce a special celebratory service, which will consist of singing of Christmas carols interspersed with very short, and he made that point, very short reading so they didn't get too bored, it would help to get people out of the pubs and into the church or into the cathedral. And that was as far ago as 1880. So that was the original idea of putting the readings and the carols together as a special service, a carol service. And then, of course, it got taken up by everybody since then. Nowadays, we are very fortunate to have such a large wealth of material to work from. I mentioned the Carols for Choirs books, but there are umpteen other places where you can find really good and interesting arrangements and original compositions too. If you think of the arrangers who've contributed so much, David Wilcox has to be the most important, because he kind of started it all off in the 60s, writing the descants that became so familiar, and some of the great arrangements of very traditional carols. It really stems from David Wilcox back in the very early 60s. And then people like John Rutter, obviously, and Bob Chilcott, and numerous others have taken up the idea of doing sometimes elaborate, sometimes very clever arrangements of traditional Christmas carols, which are a joy for us to work with, because of course the audiences want to hear the familiar tunes, they want to hear the familiar carols. But if we had to do the same arrangements year after year, it will get very, very tedious. So the fact that there's all these new arrangements constantly being made just brightens the whole thing up and injects new life into some of these carols, which, as you can see, have been around for, in some cases, for centuries. And now, of course, we also have a whole tradition of composers writing new and original carols. People like Will Todd, John Tavener, Judith Weir, you name it. Almost everybody who is a recognized composer these days will try their hand at writing a new carol, sometimes with a new, specially written text. Other times they use a traditional text, again, sometimes going back many, many centuries, but injecting life into the world of the Christmas carol and Christmas music. So on balance, I think we are very lucky, provided we don't get too confused between the Advent period of reflection and the Christmas period of real celebration and joy. I think that we are very fortunate that there's such a wealth of really good, fun music that we can use at this time, which is both appropriate, very popular, and absolutely endless in terms of its variety. So I'm just going to leave you with one example. This is nothing particularly unusual, but it's a very clear case of the kind of thing I'm talking about. This is an arrangement of Ding Dong Merrily on High, which is, of course, one of the most popular and well-known. The melody is 16th century, so we're talking about the 1500s here for the melody, would you believe? The words were kind of crafted or put together in the early part of the 20th century. And this particular arrangement is by Mac Wilberg, an American composer born in 1955. And this is a version that I first heard King's Cambridge doing a few years ago. It's absolutely bog standard Ding Dong Merrily on High, but at the same time, it's a really fun arrangement with a very elaborate organ part. And the way Kings do it, it's absolutely glorious. Well, I like it anyway. So if you've got to have Ding Dong Merrily on High, and let's face it, we all have to do Ding Dong Merrily on High at some point, this is as good a version as I know. So this is King's College, Cambridge, Ding Dong Merrily on High, arranged by Mac Wilberg. Here we go. So I've just lost my Bluetooth. Ding dong.
Jingle bells we swung, and the yo-yo-yo, like Christian people song. Hosanna in excelsis. Hosanna in excelsis.
Having said it's Advent and not Christmas, I can only apologize for that. But I just thought that's really fun, and hopefully that's the first and still the best version of Ding Dong Merrily on High you've heard this year. So many thanks to you all. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I shall see you again soon. Bye for now.